is Karina Gorfin, and here's my 90s story.
Hi, my name is Eugene Gorfin, and this is my 90s story.
So my name is Linda Scherzer, and my 90s story was spent on the front lines of the Arab-Israeli conflict, far, far away in the Middle East. I had a front row seat on history during a very turbulent time in the Israeli-Palestinian story.
Hi, I'm Stacy Fast, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the 90s.
My 90s story is about firsts. I was the first in my family to go away to college. That happened in 1991. I was the first to graduate from college. I was the first to move away to get a job. And then I also met my first wife. She's also my only wife, but I met her in the 90s as well.
For me, the 90s is a recollection of school. I ended college, or I was the tail end of college years, and the beginning of my law school career. Also a time I remember that my grandmother from Russia came to visit us. It was the first time in over, I want to say 15 years, that she was permitted to leave the country to come to the United States. Back in 1991 was the end of the Soviet Union.
What defines the 90s for me as a CNN correspondent is the explosion in the communications industry. I mean, to have a network that was broadcasting to the entire world, to be able to report news, and especially war, like the Persian Gulf War, the first Gulf War that I reported, to report in real time was just absolutely astounding, mind-blowing, fascinating, because it had never been done before.
Fusion has now produced a slight modification to the standing order. If a person can reach his sealed bomb shelter with a gas mask within 2 minutes after the air raid siren has sounded, civil defense officials say it's now safe to go downstairs. But the Army warns that the biggest threat still remains a chemical attack, and sealed rooms offer the best protection. Furthermore, they're worried about people running out of their apartments to bomb shelters.
The rise of capitalism in Russia, that created a new global market. I remember that because one of my first jobs as an attorney was in an international trade company that was trading now and was permitted to trade openly with the former Soviet Union countries, all separately. Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of the different republics were now able to do business with American companies.
Remember, obviously, sports during the 90s. Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls won 6 championships.
The Chicago Bulls have won their 6th NBA championship, and it's their second three-peat.
I lived in Chicago. It was purely amazing. Mike Tyson was a beast. He was something like we'd never seen before. Tiger Woods came onto the scene in the 1990s. Phenom, young golfer, was amazing. Watched Agassi as well as Sampras play tennis in the 90s. They battled each other just sort of like the way that Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer battle one another today.
Got it. So as he returns, he will be serving for the championship.
An ace to clinch his first Australian crown.
Game 7.
The most exciting time for my husband during the 90s is when the Rangers won the Stanley Cup. After so many years, he waited a lifetime to see this. The Rangers won the Stanley Cup against the Vancouver Canucks, and it was like New York went wild. There was a ticker tape parade. People were absolutely bananas over this, and it was the greatest day of his life for sure.
Yeah. Oh, to all the ladies in the house.
Oh, fun stuff. Well, during college days and law school days, music was, obviously the forefront of our lives. All we did was listen to it. Madonna was one of my favorite. Who else did I love? I love George Michael. Unfortunately, he's passed. Whitney Houston was a big diva back in the day. Certainly Michael Jackson. But there was a lot of those one-hit wonders, like Vanilla Ice, I remember. And it was like the grunge music was very popular, I remember back in the 90s. Certainly interesting rap, like Naughty by Nature, whatever I remember, DMX. Those were, and they're still popular today.
Like that, like this, and it's like that, like this, and like that, and it's like this.
To me, music in the 90s meant two things: hip hop, rap, and grunge. So in the hip hop, it was really just beginning. You had West Coast, East Coast rap, you had Biggie Smalls and Tupac Shakur, you had NWA, you had Snoop Dogg, you had Dr. Dre. You know, all that influenced me as a young kid. I was having fun in college and listening to hip hop. But more importantly, I think it was the grunge movement. And Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana was really something that just took hold of all the kids, and college kids and high school kids. But we just played the CDs; those existed at that time too, over and over and over again. It was pretty cool.
TV shows, I loved all the medical shows, so I love Chicago Hope and I loved ER. Sitcoms, Friends and Seinfeld, some of the best shows that were ever produced and I still watch today in reruns, all began in the 90s.
More clothes in the dryer? We were on a break!
We were on a break.
We were on a break! We were on a break!
Sex and the City was started as an HBO show and then it rolled into 2 or 3 movies. But that was really an awakening and showing women of power, women with jobs and careers and what single life in New York City was really about. So I loved that show.
Fun times in the 90s, hanging out, watching movies, Goodfellas, Casino, so gangster movies, and we still get influenced by those today. Fun things like sitting back and watching 90210 and Melrose Place, and all those got revived. And so you see a lot of things that we enjoyed watching in the 90s coming back. Other movies that I enjoyed from the 90s, Forrest Gump. It was very interesting, sort of going back in time and seeing how Tom Hanks portrayed a character that took us through the decades. And I think that's a way to sort of relive and look at time at a certain point in time by sort of reliving history. It was pretty cool.
My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
My 2 favorite movies of the 90s were Titanic, which was just a magnificent, big, beautiful, historical love story, which I just fell in love with and saw several times. And the other one was Schindler's List. And that was just a remarkable film that had made a huge impact on me and I think on the world's understanding of the Holocaust. I was privileged to have been with CNN when that movie came out, so I interviewed one of the survivors, a Schindler survivor who was living in Israel with his wife. He was featured in the film because he and his wife got married in a secret ceremony in the concentration camp, and I got to interview him and still maintain a relationship with his daughters until today. But those two films were just, 2, I think, of the best films of all time, not just of the 90s.
In college days, everything was oversized, everything was baggy, ugly socks that were really big. I was not impressed with, and if you recall, like the Madonna looking outfits, they were not very fashionable. So really the only thing I can recall is Princess Diana, who was a big icon, and John F. Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy. they were big fashion icons because they were still portrayed a very elegant, classic look to fashion. Ralph Lauren, Donna Karan were big in those days. So big American designers were fashionable in the 90s, which they are still fashionable today.
Shoulder pads. Shoulder pads, which was the fashion, trend of the 90s, at least for me, and had a really nice way of slimming the rest of your body because it provided, this kind of proportion to hips and the silhouette that I was looking for, but it didn't last very long, and I was one of the very disappointed women when shoulder pads, went into the dustbin of history. It was the technology. It was the technology, the ability to put a satellite dish into a conflict zone and to be able to report literally as Scud missiles were flying into Tel Aviv, or the Allied forces led by the United States was bombing Kuwait, bombing Iraq, actually, that had invaded Kuwait, to be able to plant a satellite dish and a reporter in these areas of conflict to report literally as the missiles were flying was something that had never been done before and was really a result of the explosion in the telecommunications industry.
The internet came to true global fruition in the 90s. The World Wide Web was introduced in 91, and browsers soon followed, making web browsing truly possible.
Back in the 90s, obviously, this didn't exist. What this was, in my world, was a telephone the size of a brick. It looked like a brick. It was a phone. All it did was accept incoming calls and outgoing calls. It didn't have anything that a smartphone has, obviously, but it was miraculous for us at the time. I remember the first kind of exciting device in my world was an answering machine. I know it sounds crazy, but the idea that I could leave my apartment but I wouldn't miss a call because there was a device that would actually record incoming calls was just, magical to me.
We started in the 90s with just pagers. I remember when my first son was born, my husband had a pager on him at work, just in case I needed him. I think we had car phones, but they were attached they were mounted into the car, so they weren't mobile. And then as the 90s went on, I think the flip phone came out and the BlackBerry eventually came out. But overall, we were way more connected as people, and we communicated, and we had to write letters still, and we used the mail system, and we spoke on the phone, and we left phone messages, and there was no texting, and we didn't Google. We actually had to look things up in a book, in a dictionary, in an encyclopedia. We had to stop for directions. There was no Waze, there was no Google Maps. So in that sense, we had to communicate with other people, which I personally miss.
Going to the University of Illinois, which had a lot of things that were on the forefront of technology at the time. I remember using Windows. I remember using a web browser that didn't even exist. The internet really didn't exist. Chat rooms, all of that was inside the campus, sort of like when Facebook was first started in the 2000s, where it was just at Harvard. But we got to use things like the precursor to AOL chat and the first web browser called Mosaic before there was Netscape or Internet Explorer or Mozilla or Google Chrome. And then everyone had a big scare.
In focus this evening, the glitch that could short-circuit cyberspace.
On New Year's Day 2000, is it possible that we're in for an international disaster because so many of the world's computers will be utterly confused by what date it is?
I also recall back in the 90s some interesting both political and legal issues that were arising in the news at that time. There was the impeachment discussion for President Clinton because of his perjury about his involvement with Monica Lewinsky. I recall that being a very big hostile discussion. There was certainly the case of the century of O.J. Simpson, how he was acquitted, even though there was a lot of evidence to prove him guilty for killing his wife, Nicole Brown, and her friend, Ron Goldman.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187.
Well, there was really one scandal, and that was Monica Lewinsky. I mean, that was a big deal at the time.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong.
This led to an impeachment trial on perjury and obstruction of justice charges, where he was acquitted thanks to strong support from Democrats.
Two things that sort of continue to prevail today that I recall about the 90s is kids bringing guns into schools and needlessly just terrorizing their classmates and their communities. So Columbine happened, first mass shooting where 2 high school kids decided to come in and just ruin a lot of people's lives and impact the country. And we thought gun control would start to be a much more prevalent discussion then. And however, almost 20 years later, 20-some years later, it continues to be a discussion in this country and a very serious issue. The other thing is domestic terrorism with Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing.
Bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens.
The nation now had to come to grips with the shock of this unprecedented event and the reality of terrorism in the American heartland.
First and actually most horrific domestic bombing ever. But we've seen these happen in a number of countries, including our own, where sort of people take matters into their own hands, but in a negative way, and just conduct domestic terrorism for causes that there could be civil disobedience as opposed to bringing mass casualties, whether it be things like Las Vegas, or we've seen things in Spain, and actual terrorism, or London. But those things are just needless, and once again, those are recollections that I have that they began in the 90s. Magic Johnson tested positive for HIV. It wasn't any longer a disease that was ravaging other parts of the world or non-affluent communities or small sectors of the community like the gay community at that point in time. It was now everywhere. Everyone who contracted HIV that then led to AIDS would die within a very short period of time. There was very little medicine. There were kids who were dying from it, who were being born with HIV and AIDS. And so Ryan White was one of that example. That story was someone who had a transfusion, or wasn't someone who was a symbol, or who became a symbol of the AIDS movement. And lots of charities were put together, and thankfully today, it's pretty much under control. We have medicine, and we have education, and we have knowledge.
Had achieved, something that resembled equality, and I think we were all completely blind to the fact that Black people are treated differently by the police, in all sectors of society. They're treated differently. And when Rodney King, after the riots, said, desperately, can't we all just get along?
I just want to say, can we all get along? Can we get along?
It was just a kick to the gut that we are not a society. We are a society that in theory values everything. We're based on equal rights and free expression and all the values that as Americans and as Jews we hold dear. but that in practice we are still that segregated society.
We've all seen the pictures of Los Angeles police officers beating a man they had just pulled over.
When most of the primarily Caucasian officers were found not guilty in the assault on King, an African-American man, tensions boiled over. LA erupted into violence, murder, and looting for 6 days, a rare glimpse of unsuppressed rage in modern America.
It was the first time I recall having videos in the media for the whole world to see how brutal of an attack that was, and what resulted in a very big political and social divide in our country, because Rodney King, the police officers who were accused and tried were then acquitted. I can end by saying that the 90s ended on a great note for me. I met my husband and we ended up getting married in the new century, so I think the 90s being the sort of the end of a century is a cool time to have lived. Of course, there were a lot of things that were not so memorable back politically and worldwide. However, the idea of going into a new century was something that was very exciting and enlightening. So I think we all look forward to that.